Hi, everybody. What we're going to do today is start part two of my comic coloring demonstration, and we're going to use our Captain America artwork to work on that. So let me share the screen and show you how this is going to work. All right, so what you see here is the fully colored Captain America page. I have the ink layer by itself on top, and that ink layer is set to multiply. And in between the background and the ink layer is my color layer. And that's the one where I went through and colorized all of the open spaces inside the inked artwork to make Captain America. So by separating the ink from the color, I can now control where I place new color and enhancements. And specifically, we're talking about doing shadows, shadows and highlights, and a few special effects. So the simplest way to do this, especially for a comic coloring page, is going to be use a hue and saturation adjustment. And so let's try by starting with shadows and see what we can do here. I'm going to click on hue and saturation. And there you see it pulled up the saturation dialog box. I'm going to go ahead and name this layer shadow. All right. And then I'm going to tweak the hue and saturation here to see what happens. So watch what happens as I lower the lightness. I darken it, okay? Darkens the entire picture. Don't worry about it. We're going to do that. I'm going to increase the saturation a little bit too. By doing that, what I'm doing is I'm deepening the color from the shadow, and then I'm increasing the color inside the shadow itself. And I've done it kind of holistically over the entire picture. All right, but I don't want to keep it that way. I'm using this to paint in the shadow in a minute. So I'll show you how that works. Notice how that adjustment layer came along with a mask. Okay, so that mask is going to reveal or hide portions of the picture. And what I want to do to paint this shadow is I actually want to hide the entire mask. So I want it so that the shadow is invisible, and then I'm going to paint it back in. So here's what I mean. I'm going to take my paint bucket. The color set for my foreground is black, and I'm going to click inside the mask, making sure the mask is highlighted. I'm going to click, tap, and basically paint that mask black, which hides that entire shadowy color, which I had used before. So how does this technique actually work? First thing we do is, because I have a flat color on a separate layer, I can use that flat color to help me build a mask. So I'm going to use the magic wand, and I'm going to click, let's say in Cap's blue costume here. I'm going to click that. I can hold shift and I can click another area as well. So now I've selected all of the areas of Cap's costume that are blue. I'm going to go back to the shadow layer and I'm going to click on the mask. So now I will be working on the mask. I'm going to change tools over to a paintbrush, and I'm going to pick, for this, I'm going to use like the airbrush, and I'm going to make it much smaller. So I'm going to click on the bracket keys, and I'm going to make that much, much smaller. All right, before I paint, I'm also going to change the intensity of this airbrush. It so happens that if your airbrush is set to like 100% opacity with a high percentage on flow, it's going to dump out a lot of color. I want to back that off so it's kind of light. So I'm going to set my opacity to like 20%. A hotkey for that is you can click the number on your keyboard. If you click 3, for example, it becomes 30% opacity. 2, it becomes 20%. 9, it becomes 90%. So I'm just going to click over and hit it on 20. So it's low opacity, and while I paint, it's going to be kind of light, and that's going to allow me to kind of build it up. Now, the last thing I need to do to set up my brush is I need to switch to white, because I'm going to be painting in white, and that's going to reveal that shadow back into the picture. So watch as I paint like on the side of his leg here. And maybe that opacity is a little bit too much, so I'm going to bump it up maybe to 6. I put it on the side of his arm. See that? See how just by using that little airbrush and painting, painting in white on that mask, I'm putting that color of that hue and saturation layer back over the existing color. And by using the flat color to create a mask, the area where I paint is confined to the specific color I want to colorize. Now I could repeat that process on the same shadow layer as needed. So let's say I want to start painting red. Well, I could do what I did before, go back and select the color layer, select the magic wand, click the red, hold shift to click more than one piece at a time. Then I need to make sure that I return to the shadow layer and click on the mask. That's one of the steps that people tend to forget sometimes, especially newbies. They'll just start painting on the color layer. There's nothing worse than that, to realize that you've been painting along and you've been stuck on the paint layer and you've actually painted over the flat color. Got to make sure you're on the mask layer. One way to protect that maybe would be to lock the color layer, put a little lock on it so you don't actually accidentally paint on it. That's helpful. I would do the same thing to the ink, is click the little lock button so I don't accidentally paint on it. Okay, so now I got the mask selected again, and now I'm going to go back with my paintbrush, that airbrush, and paint into the edges of his knuckles here. Try to paint some dark shadow. Now that creates kind of a smooth color, right? Where it's, specifically kind of smooth and faded along the edges. It really depends on the kind of technique you want in your picture. Sometimes comic book art has kind of a airbrush feel where it's kind of smooth and painted out. And so that's what that brush will do for you. So you'd spend time going around. You could, however, paint with a different brush. Like let's say I pick up, I don't know, I scroll down to one of the vintage brushes, try something with a little texture on it, paint with that instead. Notice how it puts a little texture into the paint brush stroke. So that may be something I want to achieve. And by using that textured brush, I get a different effect on the paintbrush itself, or on the appearance of the shadow. Okay, so I would do that for the whole picture. I'd go through and isolate certain areas, pick a brush, paint him white in the mask, and reveal the shadows wherever I want the shadows. Okay, and this is just your first pass. There are other ways to add additional color and highlight, which I'll get to in a little bit. Let's talk instead now about highlight. To add highlight to the picture, I would do very similar to what I did with the shadow. I would go ahead and add a hue and saturation layer. This one I'm going to call highlight. All right, and I'm going to make adjustments to the hue and saturation slider. I'm going to increase the lightness, increase the saturation. Again, I like increasing saturation and lightness at the same time because saturation increases the color hue while the lightness makes it brighter. And just do it until you feel like it's really bright enough to look like a pretty decent highlight. All right, now I need to go ahead and hide this adjustment so then I can paint it back in. So switch to black, switch to your paint bucket. I'm going to press G to switch to my paint bucket, and with the mask selected, I'm going to go ahead and paint inside the picture with that black color, darkening the highlight mask. Now it's time to go back to that paintbrush, and now I'm going to mask an area I'm going to paint with a highlight. So let's go back to his suit. So I'm going to click on the blue part of his suit, go back to that highlight mask, and now with the brush, watch what happens if I paint with that white. I've still got that texture brush, but I kind of like it, so I'm gonna leave it. It's a little too big on his leg. I'll have to shrink it down a little bit. Now, something to keep in mind as you paint, especially as you're trying to paint with highlight and shadow, is you have to plan a light source. Now, granted, this is comics, so it's fantasy, but I should be using a consistent light source. I should be imagining where the light's coming from. So in this case, it's over his head. So his shoulders, top of his head, those areas, forward-facing parts of his legs and stuff, those are going to become highlight areas, and everything underneath will become darker. All right, so quick, down and dirty, added some highlight to the picture. And even though it's a little weird, I'm kind of digging this highlight brush. So this texture brush, so I'm kind of sticking with it. But again, you can go back to the Airbrush if you like, whatever you want. Go back, pick up the red, put a little highlight. I'm just going to do his glove this time. Just pick up that little highlight color and, add that highlight to his glove. And so the logic here is that as you're trying to add color value to your picture, it's pretty much 3 levels that are going to get you by, especially in kind of a comic book setting, is if you've got a medium base color, which we painted in flat, and then we add a shadow and a highlight, we give depth and dimension to our picture. Beyond that are special effects. So let's try adding a little special effect to this picture. So let's say right now I've got, I want to add some like special effect to his shield and maybe something to these motion lines. Okay, so right now I need that shield to have kind of a sheen on it, maybe kind of a gradient, let's say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a selection and try to match the shape of the shield, and then paint a gradient into it, and then do a blending mode and see what happens. All right, so I'm not going to spend the time to use the pen tool and get this real precise. I'm going to do this kind of quickly so you can kind of see it. So I'm going to go ahead and lasso the shield, and it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be close, but not quite perfect. There we go. Maybe hold shift and add a little more to that little selection. Okay, that's pretty good. Good enough. Now, I need to make a separate layer for this. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and call this shield. It's a good habit to get into, to label your layers so you know where things are and what things are doing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and switch my color. I'm going to get white in my fill box, and I'm going to change to the gradient tool. All right, if you look up at the top of your gradient tool selector, you have basics, and up there I want to select white to transparent because my foreground color is white and I want it to fade to transparent. All right, and what I'm going to do with this new layer and this transparent gradient is I'm going to pick an insertion point and drag away and see if I can't add that gradient. And actually I did it backwards. I want to start on the right and drag downward to the left. Okay, maybe try that again. Drag down a little bit. So see how it puts like a little, the bright white gradient is up at the top of the selection. Okay, so not really amazing, but watch what happens when I start playing around with blending modes. Like I take this layer with the gradient in it and I try like overlay or vibrant or vivid. I think probably, the change isn't that dramatic. I'm going to go with like hard light, for example, and then I'm going to adjust the opacity. All right, so that gives it just a little bit of a gradient fade on it instead of painting it in. But let's say I want to add a little more extreme reflection on it to make it look a little more shiny. Here's something you can do. I'm going to go ahead and make a selection out of that shield layer. To make a selection quickly, what you do is you press Command or Control on a PC, and then you click on the shield layer by itself. All right, so what it did was it made a selection out of that shape. All right. Actually, another way to do this, I'm going to stick with this. Never mind. So now I'm going to switch back to my paintbrush. And this time around, I'm going to pick that soft round airbrush. And I'm going to paint a line here in white. What I'm doing is making these stripes, and sometimes these little stripes come through on the shape and make it look like there's a little bit of a sheen. And actually, you know what I'm realizing here is what would make this a little more dramatic is if the white sheen went over the top of the ink layer. So let's see what happens if I actually move this layer above ink and see what happens. See that? See how it kind of made that and kind of enhanced that highlight because it kind of dimmed the ink line. It's not quite perfect because my selection wasn't quite right, and maybe I can modify the opacity a little bit here to play around with it. But what I'm trying to explain here is how you can use different layers, layer effects, painting techniques to create different types of effects on an object. All right, so shield looks kind of crummy. I might spend more time fixing that in a different way later on, but I do want to go ahead and move on to another area of the picture. Last but not least, I think I could enhance kind of like an explosion behind him. I don't really know what Jack Kirby intended by this cloudy thing. Maybe it's supposed to be smoke or something else, but maybe in the background, I want to have a more dramatic kind of explosive effect. I could try using a gradient or other painting techniques in a similar way, or I might create like a star pattern or do something like that. So let's see what might happen if I wanted to create like a star type pattern or something. So what I'm going to do is switch over to my pen tool. Okay, now up on the selector here, when I click pen tool, it allows me to make either a path or a shape. In this case, I am going to go ahead and make a shape. So I want to switch that and make sure it's a shape. And then I'm going to go ahead and use white as my color, my main color. And when I start drawing, you'll see what happens with the shape as I go. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is just make kind of a random starburst behind him. So I'm going to just click. Oops, I switched tools, sorry. And just click. And I'm going to zoom out just a hair so this is a little easier. Now, one of the reasons I chose to separate the background from the Captain America layer was so that I could do something like this. So I could actually separate any kind of background painting effect from the character himself. All right. Now I could go in and tailor this a little more. Like I could use my direct selection arrow, maybe move a couple of these paths to kind of increase the width of the starburst if I need to change its position a little bit. I just want to make these a little bit wider. A little too narrow before, so I'm going to move some of these points. Yeah, just make it a little more interesting. All right. You can fiddle with that for a while. All right, so now what am I going to do? Try blending modes and see what happens. So let's try a couple of the blending modes. Overlay, soft light. Soft light might do it. So point is that when you take a shape like that and you try a different blending mode, you can get some interesting texture and burst patterns to appear in the character. I'm going to go ahead and adjust that shape a little more. You can always come back with the pen tool if you want and add a few points, an additional burst in the middle. That's what I'm doing here. Just trying to make it a little more dramatic. There you go. So maybe you get the idea. By adding starburst shapes, using those vector shapes in combination with the color layers, you can create a more interesting design, more organic, unique design. Messing around with the shape color, messing around with the blending mode creates different blending effects onto the page. All right, so those are some of the basics of colorizing your flat color, using highlight and shadow, using some shapes and some other special effects to try to create something a little more interesting. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good start so you can finish off yours. All right, see you next time.